The screaming started before Marcus even saw what happened. Shoppers scattered in every direction as a woman in an expensive coat crumpled to the food court floor, her hands clutching her swollen belly, while others pulled out phones to record or simply stared in shock. Marcus Thompson didn't hesitate. He dropped his mop bucket and ran toward the chaos, his work uniform still damp from cleaning spills. What he didn't know was that this single moment of compassion would unravel secrets that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus's sneakers squeaked against the polished mall floor as he reached the pregnant woman. She was conscious but pale, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her designer handbag had spilled its contents across the tiles, credit cards and business cards scattered like fallen leaves. While teenagers nearby filmed with their phones and elderly shoppers whispered among themselves, Marcus knelt beside her without a second thought. "Hey, it's going to be okay," he said softly, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. "Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes found his face, and for a moment, the panic in them seemed to ease. She was beautiful even in distress, with long black hair now disheveled and worry lines creasing her forehead. Her coat was cashmere, her shoes probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, but none of that registered as he focused on helping her. "Sophia," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mall's background noise. "I think something's wrong with the baby." Her hand pressed against her stomach, and Marcus could see the fear flooding her features. He'd seen that same terror before, in hospital waiting rooms and emergency situations that still haunted his dreams. "How far along are you?" Marcus asked, gently helping her sit up against a nearby planter. His movements were careful but confident, the kind of assurance that comes from experience with medical emergencies. The crowd had formed a circle around them, some still recording, others calling for help on their phones. Mall security was nowhere to be seen, and the nearest store employees seemed frozen in uncertainty. 7 months, Sophia managed, wincing as another wave of discomfort washed over her. "I was just buying baby clothes when everything went dizzy." She gestured weakly toward a maternity store across the concourse, where shopping bags still sat abandoned by the entrance. Marcus noticed her wedding ring was missing, just a pale band of skin where it used to be. Without being asked, Marcus shrugged out of his work jacket and placed it under her head as a makeshift pillow. The fabric was worn but clean, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and the mint gum he chewed during his shifts. "Did you drive here today?" he asked, already mentally calculating the fastest route to the hospital. His own car was old and unreliable, but it would have to do if the ambulance took too long. "No, I took a cab," Sophia said, closing her eyes against a fresh wave of nausea. "My car's in the shop, and I didn't want to bother anyone." The admission revealed more than she probably intended. No husband to call, no family members on speed dial, no one waiting at home to worry about her. Marcus recognized the isolation immediately because he lived it every day. The sound of sirens finally broke through the mall's ambient noise, and Marcus felt his shoulders relax slightly. "Help's coming," he told Sophia, noticing how her breathing had become more regular since he'd arrived. Sometimes just having someone stay calm beside you was enough to keep panic at bay. He'd learned that lesson the hard way during his own darkest moments. As the paramedics rushed through the mall entrance with their equipment, Marcus started to step back and let the professionals take over. But Sophia's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Please don't leave," she said, her eyes wide with something beyond physical pain. "I don't have anyone else to call." The words hit Marcus harder than they should have. He understood being alone in a crowd, facing medical emergencies without a support system, making impossible decisions with no one to share the burden. His shift supervisor would probably write him up for abandoning his post, but he couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. It wasn't in his nature. "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus promised, settling back down beside her as the paramedics began their assessment. One of them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, immediately took charge of the situation. She checked Sophia's vital signs while asking rapid-fire questions about her medical history and symptoms. Marcus found himself answering some of them, having picked up details during their brief conversation. The crowd began to disperse as the medical team worked, the excitement of the emergency fading into the mall's usual afternoon rhythm. Shoppers returned to their errands, store employees went back to their tasks, and the food court slowly filled with the normal sounds of families sharing meals and teenagers hanging out after school. But Marcus stayed exactly where he was, holding Sophia's hand as the paramedics prepared to transport her to the hospital. What neither of them knew was that this moment of human kindness was about to set in motion a series of events that would reveal secrets, test loyalties, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most profound connections happen between strangers who share nothing except the willingness to help when it matters most. Marcus Thompson's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 every morning, the same harsh electronic beeping that had dragged him from sleep for the past 18 months. His small apartment in Brookfield Heights was quiet except for the sound of his neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. He rolled out of bed with practiced efficiency, his body moving through the familiar routine that had become his lifeline since everything fell apart. The bathroom mirror reflected a man who looked older than his 29 years. Dark circles shadowed his brown eyes, and his black hair needed cutting, but there was no money for luxuries like barber shops. Marcus splashed cold water on his face and brushed his teeth with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to find structure in the smallest details. Every morning was the same because consistency was the only thing keeping him afloat. In the kitchen, he made 2 bowls of cereal, the store-brand kind that came in a bag instead of a box. The first bowl he ate standing at the counter, scrolling through his phone to check for any emergency messages from Mrs. Rodriguez next door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second bowl he carried down the narrow hallway to Emma's room, where his 5-year-old daughter was already awake, sitting cross-legged on her bed with a picture book in her lap. "Morning, sunshine," Marcus said, settling the bowl on her small knit stand. Emma looked up at him with eyes that were exact copies of her mother's, a deep green that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for such a young face. Her curly brown hair was a mess from sleep, and she wore pajamas with cartoon unicorns that had been washed so many times the colors had faded to pastels. "Is today a mall day?" Emma asked, her voice still thick with sleep. She had learned to categorize her father's work schedule by location, because it helped her understand when he would be home and when Mrs. Rodriguez would pick her up from school. Mall days meant he worked until evening, cleaning the corridors and food court after the stores closed. Office building days meant earlier hours but longer commutes on 3 different buses. "Yes, baby girl," Marcus confirmed, sitting on the edge of her bed while she ate her cereal. "Mrs. Rodriguez will get you from school, and I'll be home by 8 to help with homework." It was the same conversation they had every few days, but Emma always asked because routine made her feel secure. She had lost enough unpredictability in her short life. Marcus had never intended to become a single father. 2 years ago, he'd been an assistant manager at a sporting goods store, married to his high school sweetheart Jessica, living in a decent apartment with plans to buy a house once they saved enough for a down payment. They talked about having more children, taking family vacations, building the kind of stable life that neither of them had experienced growing up. Jessica worked part-time at a daycare center and took evening classes to become a teacher. Their future seemed mapped out in careful, achievable steps. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while Marcus was helping 3-year-old Emma build a tower with plastic blocks. Jessica had been driving home from class when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of her car. She died instantly, the police officer explained in a voice that Marcus later realized was practiced from delivering similar news too many times. The other driver walked away with minor injuries. Everything unraveled with devastating speed. Jessica's life insurance barely covered the funeral costs and hospital bills. Marcus discovered that his grief made it impossible to focus at work, and his performance suffered until he was eventually let go. They had to move to a cheaper apartment then. An even cheaper one when Marcus couldn't find steady employment. He took whatever jobs he could find, working retail during holiday seasons, helping friends with construction projects, doing delivery work that paid cash under the table. The janitorial job at Riverside Mall wasn't glamorous, but it offered something Marcus desperately needed: health insurance and a predictable schedule. He worked 4 10-hour shifts each week, cleaning stores after hours, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, and maintaining the common areas. The pay was barely enough to cover rent, groceries, and Emma's necessities, but it was steady income. In a world that had become frighteningly unstable, Marcus finished getting Emma ready for school, braiding her hair the way Jessica used to do and packing her lunch in a worn backpack that had belonged to another child before them. He walked her to the bus stop 3 blocks away, where other children from their neighborhood waited with parents who looked as tired as he felt. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Emma pulled her too small jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Daddy," Emma said as the school bus rounded the corner, "do you think Mommy can see me from heaven?" The question came without warning, the way children's profound thoughts often did. Marcus knelt down to her level, his heart clenching with familiar pain mixed with fierce protectiveness. "I think she watches over you every single day," he said, straightening her backpack straps. "And I think she's proud of what a smart, kind little girl you've become." Emma nodded solemnly, then kissed his cheek before climbing onto the bus. Marcus watched until the yellow vehicle disappeared around the corner, carrying his entire world away for another day. The bus ride to Riverside Mall took 45 minutes and required 1 transfer downtown. Marcus used the time to listen to podcasts about financial planning and job interview skills, always hoping to improve their situation. He'd applied for dozens of positions over the past year, from retail management to office work, but his resume had gaps that were hard to explain and references from jobs that no longer existed. The economy was supposedly improving, but Marcus hadn't felt the benefits yet. Riverside Mall had been built in the 1980s and showed its age in the faded tile, work in outdated storefronts. It wasn't one of the gleaming shopping centers that attracted tourists and high-end retailers. Instead, it served the surrounding working-class neighborhoods with practical stores, a grocery chain, a discount clothing retailer, a pharmacy, and a handful of small businesses that struggled to compete with online shopping. The food court offered standard fare from national chains, alongside a few local restaurants that had been there since the mall opened. Marcus clocked in at the maintenance office, a cramped space tucked behind the customer service desk that most shoppers never noticed. His supervisor, Bill Martinez, was a 20-year veteran of mall management who treated his cleaning crew with gruff fairness. Bill understood that most of his employees were working multiple jobs or supporting families on tight budgets, and he tried to be flexible with scheduling when emergencies arose. "Thompson, I need you to focus extra attention on the food court today," Bill said, handing Marcus his assignment sheet. "Corporate's sending someone to inspect next week, and they always check that area first." Marcus nodded, knowing that corporate referred to the mysterious ownership group that had purchased the mall earlier that year. None of the employees had met the new owners, but rumors circulated about plans for renovation or possibly selling to developers. The morning passed in familiar rhythm as Marcus cleaned store windows, restocked restroom supplies, and polished the brass railings that ran along the upper-level walkways. He knew every corner of the mall, every stain that required special attention, every broken tile that needed replacement. The work was physically demanding but oddly meditative, giving him time to think and plan while his hands stayed busy. Around noon, Marcus took his lunch break in the employee room, eating a sandwich he'd packed while reading a library book about computer programming. He'd been teaching himself basic coding skills through free online courses, hoping to eventually transition into a career that offered better opportunities. The learning curve was steep for someone who hadn't been in school for over a decade, but Marcus was determined to build a better future for Emma. As he prepared to return to work, Marcus thought about the conversation he'd had with Emma that morning. She'd been asking more questions about her mother lately, and he wasn't sure how to help her process grief that seemed too complex for such a young mind. Sometimes he caught her talking to photographs or drawing pictures of the three of them together, labeling stick figures with careful letters, Daddy, me, and Mommy in heaven. The afternoon brought the usual mix of responsibilities, cleaning up spills, replacing burned-out light bulbs, and responding to maintenance requests from store managers. Marcus took pride in his work, knowing that families depended on the mall for affordable shopping, and that his efforts contributed to creating a safe, clean environment. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but it was honest work that served his community. As closing time approached, Marcus began his final rounds, checking that all stores had properly secured their entrances and that no customers remained in the building. The mall after hours had an almost peaceful quality, with only emergency lighting casting long shadows across the empty corridors. It was during these quiet moments that Marcus sometimes allowed himself to imagine different possibilities. Emma, graduating from college, owning a home with a yard where she could play, taking vacations to places they'd only seen in books. The future felt uncertain, but not hopeless. Marcus had learned to measure progress in small victories, Emma's good grades, an extra shift that meant they could afford new shoes, a month when all the bills got paid on time. He was building something sustainable from the wreckage of their old life, one careful decision at a time. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same routine, but routine had become their salvation rather than their prison. Sophia Chun's penthouse apartment commanded a breathtaking view of downtown Portland's skyline, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Willamette River winding through the city like a silver ribbon. The space was featured in architectural magazines for its minimalist design and innovative use of natural light, but Sophia barely noticed the beauty anymore. She moved through the pristine rooms like a ghost, her footsteps echoing on polished concrete floors that had never known the chaos of family life. At 31, Sophia had achieved everything her father had dreamed of when he immigrated from Taiwan, with nothing but ambition and a fierce determination to succeed in America. Shun Development had grown from a small residential construction company into one of the Pacific Northwest's most influential real estate firms, specializing in urban renewal projects that transformed neglected neighborhoods into thriving communities. Sophia's business acumen and architectural vision had expanded the company far beyond her father's original scope, but success had come at a price she was only beginning to understand. The morning after her collapse at the mall, Sophia sat in her private bathroom, staring at the positive pregnancy test that had changed everything 6 months earlier. The pristine white marble vanity held an array of expensive skincare products and vitamins prescribed by her obstetrician, Dr. Williams, who specialized in high-risk pregnancies. At 7 months, her body had finally begun to show obvious signs of the life growing inside her, but Sophia still felt disconnected from the reality of impending motherhood. Her marriage to David Chun had been more merger than romance, a union that made perfect sense on paper, but had never ignited the passion that sustained couples through real challenges. They'd met at a real estate conference in Seattle, Two ambitious professionals who shared similar backgrounds and complementary business goals. David's family owned a chain of upscale restaurants across the West Coast, and their marriage had created opportunities for profitable partnerships between their respective enterprises. The pregnancy had been unplanned but not unwelcome, at least initially. Sophia had imagined raising their child in the penthouse, creating a nursery in the spare bedroom that currently served as her home office. She'd researched the best private schools and begun making lists of everything they would need to prepare for parenthood. David had seemed pleased with the news, talking about expanding their combined business empire and creating a legacy for their future family. Everything changed during the second trimester when genetic testing revealed potential complications. The baby showed signs of a heart condition that would require surgery shortly after birth and ongoing medical care throughout childhood. Dr. Williams had been optimistic about the prognosis, explaining that pediatric cardiac surgery had advanced tremendously and that children with similar conditions often lived completely normal lives. Sophia had felt the first flutter of genuine maternal instinct, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. David's reaction had been swift and devastating. Within a week of receiving the test results, he'd suggested terminating the pregnancy, arguing that they weren't prepared to handle a child with special needs. When Sophia refused, he'd grown distant and critical, questioning every decision she made about her prenatal care. Their arguments escalated until David finally revealed his true feelings during a dinner at one of his family's restaurants. "I married you because I thought we wanted the same things," he'd said, his voice cold and calculated. "A perfect life. Successful careers. Beautiful children who would inherit our businesses. This isn't what I signed up for." Sophia had sat in stunned silence as he continued, dismantling their marriage with the same methodical precision he brought to contract negotiations. "I can't be tied to someone who's going to drain our resources on medical bills and therapy sessions. I won't let your sentimental attachment to this pregnancy destroy everything we've built." The divorce proceedings had been swift and brutal. David's attorneys had crafted a prenuptial agreement that protected most of his assets, leaving Sophia with her own business and properties, but none of the joint ventures they'd developed together. She'd been too emotionally devastated to fight the terms, focusing instead on protecting her unborn child and maintaining the stability of Chen development during the transition. Now, 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Sophia found herself completely alone for the first time in her adult life. Her parents had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, leaving her without the extended family support that might have helped her navigate single motherhood. Her professional success had always demanded such intense focus that she'd never developed close friendships outside of business relationships. The networking events and charity galas that filled her social calendar were populated by acquaintances who knew her reputation but not her heart. The loneliness had become crushing during her pregnancy, especially as her body changed and her energy levels fluctuated. Sophia had hired a housekeeper and personal assistant to manage the practical aspects of her life, but no amount of professional support could address the emotional isolation she felt. She attended prenatal appointments alone, assembled baby furniture by herself, and spent evenings researching pediatric cardiologists while sitting in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. Work had become both her salvation and her prison. Chun Development's current projects included the renovation of several historic buildings downtown, the construction of affordable housing complexes in underserved neighborhoods, and the redevelopment of struggling shopping centers throughout the metropolitan area. The Riverside Mall acquisition had been part of a larger strategy to revitalize working-class communities by creating mixed-use developments that preserved affordable retail while adding residential and office spaces. Sophia had purchased the mall 6 months earlier through a shell company, planning to study the property extensively before revealing her intentions to the current tenants and employees. She'd visited the location several times incognito, observing the foot traffic patterns and assessing the structural integrity of the building. The mall served an important function in its community, providing accessible shopping for families who couldn't afford the upscale centers in wealthier areas of the city. Her original plan had been to renovate rather than demolish, preserving the affordable retail spaces, while adding apartments and small business offices on the upper levels. The project would take 3 years to complete and would create jobs for local contractors while maintaining the mall's role as a community gathering place. Sophia had even researched the backgrounds of current employees, wanting to ensure that her redevelopment plans wouldn't displace workers who depended on their positions. The previous day's collapse at the mall had been triggered by a combination of pregnancy fatigue and the emotional stress she'd been carrying for months. Dr. Williams had warned her about the dangers of overwork during high-risk pregnancy, but Sophia had struggled to slow down when business demands remained constant. She'd been at the mall to conduct a final survey of the food court area when dizziness overwhelmed her and she'd lost consciousness. Waking up in that janitor's arms had been profoundly disorienting, not because of her physical condition, but because of the genuine kindness in his eyes. Marcus Thompson had looked at her without recognition or calculation, seeing only a pregnant woman in distress who needed help. His immediate response had been to provide comfort and protection, asking nothing in return except the chance to ensure her safety. Sophia couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her that way, without considering what she might be able to do for them in return. The hospital had kept her overnight for observation, running tests to ensure that both she and the baby were stable. "That must be heartbreaking," Sophia said, and Marcus could hear genuine emotion in her voice. Children that age are old enough to understand loss, but too young to make sense of it. How do you help her process something so painful? The question revealed a depth of thoughtfulness that impressed Marcus. Most people offered platitudes about time healing wounds, or suggested that Emma was lucky to have such a devoted father. Sophia seemed to understand the complexity of helping a child navigate grief while managing his own emotional struggles. "Honestly, I'm figuring it out as I go along," Marcus confessed. "Some days she's fine, playing and laughing like any other kid. Other days she gets sad and asks when mommy's coming home, and I have to explain again that some people go to heaven and can't come back. It never gets easier." Sophia nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the cover of her child development book. "I've been reading about helping children cope with major changes. Obviously, my situation is different, but I'm trying to prepare for the challenges my baby might face." She hesitated, then continued with obvious vulnerability. "I'm going to be a single mother too. My husband left when we found out the baby has a heart condition that will require surgery." The admission hung in the air between them, creating an unexpected bond of shared experience. Marcus felt his respect for Sophia deepen as he recognized the courage it took to face single parenthood, especially with a child who would need specialized medical care. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating, especially when you were already dealing with pregnancy and health concerns." "It was," Sophia said simply. "But it also showed me who he really was, which I suppose is better to know now than after. The baby arrives. I'd rather raise my child alone than with someone who sees medical challenges as inconveniences to be avoided." Marcus found himself impressed by her resilience and clarity of perspective. Many people in her situation would have been consumed by bitterness or self-pity, but Sophia seemed focused on moving forward constructively. "Your baby is lucky to have a mother who's already thinking about what's best for them, not what's easiest." "I hope so," Sophia replied, touching her belly again with obvious affection. "I keep wondering if I'll be enough, if I can provide everything a child needs without a partner to share the responsibilities. Some days the thought terrifies me." "The fact that you're worried about it probably means you'll do fine," Marcus said, drawing on his own experience with parental anxiety. The people who don't question themselves are usually the ones who should. Caring enough to wonder if you're doing it right is half the battle. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the young mother with twin toddlers who were clearly experiencing a meltdown of epic proportions. The woman looked harried and overwhelmed as she tried to manage two crying children while ordering food and juggling diaper bags and sippy cups. Other customers were starting to stare, and Marcus could see the mother's embarrassment growing with each passing moment. Without discussing it, both Marcus and Sophia stood up simultaneously. Marcus approached the struggling mother while Sophia gathered napkins and wet wipes from a nearby condiment station. "Can we help?" Marcus asked the woman, his voice gentle and non-judgmental. Sometimes it takes a village, especially with twins. The mother's relief was immediate and profound. "Thank you," she said, tears of frustration threatening to spill over. "They're both teething, and I thought getting out of the house would help, but everything's going wrong." One of the toddlers had dropped his toy under the table, while the other was refusing to sit in her stroller and demanding to be held. Sophia knelt down to retrieve the fallen toy, cleaning it carefully with a wet wipe before handing it back to the little boy. Her movements were natural and maternal, and Marcus found himself wondering if she'd had experience with children despite not having any of her own yet. The gesture calmed the child immediately, and his crying subsided to occasional hiccups. Meanwhile, Marcus helped the mother organize her bags and suggested a table near the play area, where the twins could see other children and be distracted from their discomfort. "My daughter went through the same phase," he told her as they relocated. "Their supplies. Everything's harder when they're not feeling well, but it does pass eventually." The mother's gratitude was overwhelming, and she insisted on buying them both coffee as a thank you gesture. As they returned to their table with steaming cups, Marcus noticed that several other customers had witnessed their spontaneous teamwork. A few smiled approvingly, but most seemed surprised that strangers would go out of their way to help someone they didn't know. "That was really nice of you," Marcus said as they settled back into their seats. "You didn't have to help, but you jumped right in without being asked." "So did you," Sophia pointed out. "I was just following your lead. You saw someone struggling and immediately wanted to make it better." She sipped her decaf coffee thoughtfully. "I don't think I would have done that 6 months ago. I probably would have moved to a different table to avoid the noise." "What changed?" Marcus asked, curious about her self-reflection and honesty about personal growth. Sophia considered the question carefully before answering. "I think becoming pregnant has made me more aware of how hard parenting can be, especially when you're doing it alone. That mother could have been me in a few months, trying to manage everything by myself and feeling like I'm failing." She paused, watching the twins who were now happily eating chicken nuggets, while their mother enjoyed her first peaceful meal in hours. "Plus," Sophia continued, "watching how naturally you stepped in to help reminded me that kindness isn't really about having extra time or resources. It's about choosing to see other people's struggles and deciding they matter enough to interrupt your own day." Marcus felt something shift in his perception of Sophia as she spoke. Initially, he'd categorized her as another well-dressed customer, who probably lived a comfortable life insulated from the daily struggles he knew intimately. But her words revealed someone who was actively working to become more empathetic and aware, someone who was using her own challenges to develop greater compassion for others. "I should probably get back to work," Marcus said reluctantly, noticing that his break had stretched well beyond its allotted time. "But I'm glad I got to see you again, and I'm really glad you're feeling better. Would it be okay if I came by again sometime?" Sophia asked, and Marcus heard a note of loneliness in her voice that resonated with his own experience of social isolation. "I don't have many people to talk to these days, and this conversation has been the best part of my week." Marcus found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the implications of her request. "I'm usually here Tuesday through Friday, starting around noon." Feel free to stop by if you're in the area." As he stood to leave, he impulsively added, "And if you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. Pregnancy can be unpredictable, and it's good to know there are people around who care." The smile that spread across Sophia's face was radiant, transforming her features and making Marcus suddenly understand why David Chun had been such a fool to walk away from this remarkable woman. Over the following weeks, their friendship blossomed in the most unexpected ways. Sophia began visiting the mall every few days, timing her arrivals to coincide with Marcus's lunch breaks or the quieter afternoon hours when he could spare a few minutes for conversation. She always brought a book or laptop, establishing herself as a regular customer rather than someone who was obviously there to see him. But Marcus began to look forward to spotting her familiar figure at various tables throughout the food court. Their conversations gradually deepened beyond the surface level pleasantries that characterized most of Marcus's interactions with mall customers. Sophia proved to be an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions about Emma's adjustment to kindergarten and offering practical suggestions for managing the complex logistics of single parenthood. She never seemed judgmental about their modest circumstances or the creative solutions Marcus had developed for stretching his limited budget. In return, Marcus found himself genuinely interested in Sophia's pregnancy journey and her preparations for motherhood. She shared her anxieties about the upcoming cardiac surgery her baby would need, and Marcus was able to offer reassurance based on his experiences navigating the medical system with Emma during Jessica's illness. His practical knowledge about insurance procedures, hospital protocols, and finding specialists proved invaluable to someone facing the healthcare maze for the first time. One afternoon in late October, Sophia arrived at the mall carrying a large shopping bag from an upscale baby store downtown. She seemed unusually excited as she approached Marcus, who was taking his break at their usual table near the window, overlooking the parking lot. The autumn leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, creating a beautiful backdrop for their conversation. "I finally bought the first pieces for the nursery," Sophia announced, settling into her chair with obvious satisfaction. "I've been putting it off because everything felt so uncertain, but Dr. Williams says the baby is developing well, despite the heart condition. I decided it was time to start getting ready." Marcus smiled at her enthusiasm, remembering his own excitement when he and Jessica had prepared Emma's nursery years earlier. "That's wonderful. It must feel good to take that step forward. What did you choose?" Sophia carefully pulled out a soft yellow blanket embroidered with tiny elephants, followed by a matching mobile and a set of miniature books with colorful illustrations. Everything was beautifully made, but practical rather than ostentatious, reflecting what Marcus was learning about Sophia's thoughtful approach to most decisions. "I went with a neutral theme since I don't know the gender yet," she explained, running her fingers over the blanket's delicate stitching. The elephants represent good luck and protection in many cultures, which seemed appropriate for a baby who's going to need a little extra strength. Marcus examined the items with genuine interest, touched by how much thought Sophia had put into each selection. "These are perfect. Emma would have loved books like these when she was little. She still has some of her favorite board books. Actually, she's sentimental about things that connect her to being younger." "I'd love to meet her sometime," Sophia said, and Marcus could hear the wistfulness in her voice. "If that would be appropriate, I mean. I don't want to overstep any boundaries, but I've been curious about the little girl whose father is such a good man." The request caught Marcus off guard, not because it was unwelcome, but because it represented a significant step in their evolving relationship. Introducing Emma to new people required careful consideration, especially given her history of attachment and loss. But something about Sophia's gentle nature and obvious understanding of children made the idea feel natural rather than risky. "She'd probably like that," Marcus said after a moment of thought. "She asks about you sometimes, actually. She remembers seeing us talk here, and wants to know why the pretty lady comes to visit Daddy at work. I've told her you're a friend who's going to have a baby, and she finds that very interesting. Sophia's eyes lit up with delight. She remembers. Me? That's sweet. I'd be honored to meet her properly, whenever you think it would be good timing. They made tentative plans for Sophia to join them for a weekend visit to the nearby Children's Museum, an outing that Emma had been requesting for weeks but that Marcus had been postponing due to the admission cost. When Sophia offered to cover the tickets as a treat for all of them, Marcus initially resisted, but eventually accepted after she explained that she wanted to practice interacting with children before her own baby arrived. The museum visit turned out to be a revelation for all three of them. Emma was initially shy around Sophia, but warmed up quickly when she discovered that the elegant woman knew interesting facts about dinosaurs and was willing to crawl through the toddler-sized tunnel exhibit despite her advanced pregnancy. Sophia seemed to transform in Emma's presence, becoming more playful and spontaneous than Marcus had ever seen her. "Miss Sophia, do you think my baby brother or sister would like the bubble station?" Emma asked during lunch at the museum cafe, having immediately adopted Sophia as an honorary family member. Marcus had explained that Sophia was going to have a baby, and Emma had latched onto the idea with characteristic enthusiasm. "I think any baby would love bubbles," Sophia replied seriously, treating Emma's question with the respect that children's concerns deserved. Babies like things that move and shimmer and make them smile. "Do you think you might want to teach my baby about bubbles when they get old enough?" Emma nodded vigorously, already planning elaborate bubble-making sessions and apparently having no doubt that she would be involved in the new baby's life. Marcus watched their interaction with growing amazement, seeing how naturally Sophia engaged with his daughter and how readily Emma accepted her presence. After they dropped Emma off with Mrs. Rodriguez that evening, Marcus and Sophia sat in his car outside the apartment building, neither quite ready to end what had been a perfect day. The autumn air was crisp and clear, and they could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Thank you for today," Marcus said, turning to face Sophia in the passenger seat. "I haven't seen Emma that happy in a long time." She kept talking about all the things she wants to show your baby when they're old enough to visit the museum. "She's amazing," Sophia replied, her voice soft with emotion. "So bright and curious and kind. You're doing an incredible job raising her, Marcus. Jessica would be so proud of the little person Emma's becoming." The mention of his late wife should have been painful, but coming from Sophia, it felt like a gift rather than a reminder of loss. Marcus realized that Sophia was the first person who had acknowledged Jessica's ongoing presence in their lives without trying to minimize her importance or suggest that it was time to move on. "I think about that sometimes," Marcus admitted. "Whether I'm making the right choices, whether Emma's getting everything she needs. It's terrifying being the only one responsible for shaping another person's life. From what I can see, you're giving her the most important things any child can have," Sophia said, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Unconditional love, consistent presence, and the security of knowing she comes first in your life. Everything else is just details." The conversation was interrupted by a text message on Sophia's phone, which she glanced at with obvious irritation. "Work emergency," she explained apologetically. "One of our construction projects is having permit issues that apparently can't wait until Monday morning." Marcus had noticed that Sophia rarely talked about her job in specific terms, describing herself vaguely as working in real estate without elaborating on her role or responsibilities. He'd assumed she was probably a successful agent or maybe managed properties for a larger firm, but the urgent tone of her work communication suggested greater responsibility than he'd imagined. "I should let you get back to your life," Marcus said, preparing to drive her back to her car at the mall. "Thank you again for everything today. Emma's going to be talking about those dinosaur exhibits for weeks." "Actually," Sophia said, hesitating, as if debating whether to share something important. "I was wondering if you and Emma might like to have dinner at my place next weekend. I could cook something simple, and Emma could see where the baby's going to live, if that's not too forward." The invitation represented another significant step in their relationship, and Marcus found himself genuinely curious about Sophia's home environment. Everything about her suggested success and sophistication, but he'd also seen her natural warmth with Emma and her genuine comfort with their modest circumstances. "I'd like that," Marcus said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Emma would probably love to see the nursery and maybe help with some of the decorating if you're open to that." "That sounds perfect," Sophia replied, her smile bright even in the dim light of the car's interior. "I could use a 5-year-old's perspective on whether everything's too boring and grown up." As they drove back toward the mall, Marcus found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed since that afternoon when he'd rushed to help a stranger in distress. What had begun as a simple act of human kindness had evolved into something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for Emma as well. Sophia had brought joy and lightness into their routine in ways that Marcus hadn't experienced since Jessica's death. More importantly, she'd helped him remember that opening his heart to new connections didn't diminish his love for his late wife or threaten the security he'd worked so hard to build for Emma. Instead, it seemed to expand their capacity for happiness and create possibilities he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine. The following weekend, Marcus and Emma made their way to Sophia's downtown penthouse, both of them dressed in their best clothes and carrying a small bouquet of flowers that Emma had insisted on buying with her allowance money. The elegant building's lobby intimidated Marcus slightly, but Emma was fascinated by the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, chattering excitedly about living in a place that looked like a palace. Sophia's apartment exceeded even Marcus's elevated expectations, but what impressed him most was how she'd prepared for their visit. She'd moved breakable items out of Emma's reach, set up a small art station with child-friendly supplies, and prepared a dinner that included Emma's favorite foods alongside more sophisticated options for the adults. The nursery was a masterpiece of thoughtful preparation, decorated in soft pastels with the elephant theme Sophia had shown him weeks earlier. Emma was enchanted by every detail, from the carefully selected books to the mobile that played gentle lullabies. She immediately appointed herself as an advisor for the baby's comfort, rearranging stuffed animals and suggesting additional toys that would be appropriate for different developmental stages. "Miss Sophia, your baby is going to be so lucky," Emma announced during dinner, having thoroughly explored the apartment and pronounced it suitable for raising children. "This is the most beautiful house I've ever seen, and you're going to be the best mommy." Sophia's eyes filled with tears at Emma's earnest declaration, and Marcus felt his own throat tighten with emotion. Watching these two people he'd grown to care about so deeply, bonding over shared excitement about the future, filled him with a sense of rightness that he'd never expected to feel again. As the evening drew to a close, Emma fell asleep on Sophia's couch while they finished their coffee and talked quietly about their hopes for their children's futures. Marcus carried his sleeping daughter to the car, and Sophia walked them down to the parking garage, reluctant to end what had been another perfect day together. "Thank you for sharing your home with us," Marcus said as he secured Emma in her car seat. "This meant more than you probably realize." "It meant everything to me too," Sophia replied, touching Emma's sleeping hand gently through the car window. "Having you both here made the apartment feel like a real home for the first time since I moved in." As they drove back through the city streets toward their modest neighborhood, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what family could look like. The future that had once seemed limited by circumstances and defined by loss now felt rich with unexpected possibilities and the promise of connections that transcended traditional boundaries. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Dr. Williams had diagnosed dehydration and exhaustion, prescribing rest and stress reduction, along with increased monitoring for the remainder of her pregnancy. Sophia had lied about having someone to call for support, unwilling to admit to medical staff that she had no emergency contacts beyond her business attorney and accountant. Sitting in her penthouse the morning after her release, Sophia found herself thinking not about work deadlines or development projects, but about the man who had stayed with her until the ambulance arrived. Marcus had held her hand during the medical evaluation, speaking calmly to the paramedics and helping her remember details when shock made her thoughts fuzzy. He'd been wearing a janitor's uniform with a name tag that read Marcus Thompson, and she'd noticed wedding ring indentations on his finger, even though he wasn't wearing a band. Something about his presence had made her feel safer than she'd felt in months. Perhaps it was his obvious experience with medical emergencies, or the quiet confidence he'd shown while managing the crisis. More likely, it was the simple human connection she'd been craving without realizing how desperately she needed it. For 20 minutes, she hadn't been Sophia Chun, the CEO, or the divorced woman with the complicated pregnancy. She'd just been someone in need of help, and Marcus had provided it without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who had shown her such kindness was probably an employee of the property she owned. Sophia wondered if he knew about the planned renovations, if he was worried about job security, if he had a family depending on his income from the mall. The thought made her uncomfortable in ways she hadn't anticipated, forcing her to confront the human cost of business decisions she'd always approached from a purely financial perspective. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant reminding her about a conference call with investors, but Sophia found herself reluctant to return to the demands of her professional life. The baby kicked against her ribs as if sensing her emotional turmoil, and she placed both hands on her belly, feeling the strong movements that Dr. Williams said indicated healthy development, despite the cardiac condition. For the first time since her divorce, Sophia allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to raise her child with a partner who valued kindness over profit margins, and who understood that some things mattered more than business success. Fantasy was dangerous because it reminded her of everything she'd given up in pursuit of professional achievement, but she couldn't shake the memory of feeling protected and cared for in a stranger's arms. 3 days later, Marcus was restocking paper towels in the men's restroom near the food court when he spotted her. The elegant woman from the medical emergency was sitting alone at a corner table, slowly sipping what appeared to be herbal tea while reading a thick book. She wore different clothes this time, casual jeans and a soft sweater that made her look younger and more approachable than she had in her expensive coat. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she seemed completely absorbed in whatever she was reading. Marcus hesitated, unsure whether he should approach her. Part of him worried that she might feel uncomfortable being reminded of what had clearly been a frightening experience. Another part wondered if she would even remember him, given that she'd been in medical distress when they'd met. But something about her solitary presence at the table tugged at his consciousness, the same instinct that had driven him to help her during the collapse. He finished his restocking duties and made his way toward the food court, planning to simply wave if she looked up but not wanting to intrude on her privacy. As he drew closer, Marcus could see that she was reading a book about child development, with several bookmarks protruding from different sections. Her free hand rested protectively on her rounded belly, and there was something peaceful about her expression that made him glad to see her looking healthier. "Excuse me," Marcus said softly when he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. Sophia looked up immediately, and her face brightened with genuine recognition and what appeared to be relief. "I just wanted to make sure you were feeling better after the other day. I've been wondering how you were doing." "Marcus," Sophia said, closing the book and gesturing to the empty chair across from her, "please sit down. I was hoping I might run into you again." Her voice carried a warmth that surprised him, and Marcus found himself accepting her invitation, despite knowing that his supervisor probably wouldn't approve of him socializing with customers during work hours. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair and noticing that she looked much more rested than she had during their previous encounter. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes seemed brighter, less clouded by the panic and discomfort that had characterized their first meeting. "Much better, thanks to you," Sophia replied, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. "The doctor said it was just dehydration and exhaustion, nothing serious. But I keep thinking about how kind you were, staying with me like that. I don't think I ever properly thanked you." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Most people would have just called for help and walked away. Marcus shrugged, genuinely uncomfortable with praise for what he considered basic human decency. Anyone would have done the same thing. "You needed help, and I was there. It's not complicated." He glanced around the food court, noting that his supervisor was nowhere in sight, but still feeling slightly anxious about taking an unauthorized break. "I don't think that's true," Sophia said quietly. "I've learned that most people are too busy or too worried about liability to get involved when strangers are in trouble." "You didn't even hesitate." She studied his face with an intensity that made Marcus wonder what she was seeing there. "Do you have medical training? You seem to know exactly what to do." The question brought back memories that Marcus usually tried to avoid during working hours. "My wife had some health issues before she passed away," he said carefully, not wanting to elaborate on the months of hospital visits and emergency room trips that had taught him more about medical crises than he'd ever wanted to know. "You pick things up when you spend enough time around doctors and nurses." Sophia's expression softened with understanding and sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss. That must have been incredibly difficult, especially with a young daughter to care for." Her observation told Marcus that she'd been paying attention during their brief interaction, remembering details that most people would have forgotten in the stress of the moment. "Emma's the reason I keep going," Marcus admitted, surprised by his own willingness to share personal information with someone he barely knew. There was something about Sophia's presence that invited honesty, a quality he rarely encountered in his daily interactions with customers and coworkers. "She's 5 now, starting to ask harder questions about why her mom isn't here anymore."